Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk about getting the shots you need for your documentary film. And what I mean by that is getting shots that help tell your story effectively, but also shots that help you edit effectively. And so it's sort of a mixture of both helping to tell the story and also just making something that's aesthetically pleasing for the audience to watch. And before I get into the nitty gritty of exactly the type of shots that I think you should be getting, I want to give you this quote from a textbook I used to use for my documentary filmmaking class, but it was a little bit kind of heady and more theoretical than seemed to work very well for the classes that I've been teaching. But the author was Rabiger, and he writes, "Don't leave the camera to be a passive recorder. Make it into an instrument of ironic juxtaposition or disclosure." So, what does he mean by that? And this, when it comes to documentary filmmaking, there are a lot of different theories and philosophies on how to approach. There are some people who might say, make it a passive recorder. Just put it in the corner and don't try to influence anything. We call that like direct cinema or cinema verite or something like that, where it's the idea is to try and have minimal impact from the camera. So there's that way to do it, and then there's the other end of the spectrum where the camera is very much involved in what's happening. So you can kind of choose which direction you want to go with that. But at any rate, what he means by don't leave the camera to be a passive recorder means it's a tool and you're choosing to point it at some things and not at other things. Why? And he goes on, make it into an instrument of ironic juxtaposition or disclosure. So by disclosure, he's saying the way that you choose to position the camera, what you focus on, and all that should be revealing something to the audience. In particular, we're leaning toward things that aren't spoken in the film. But what is a particular shot? What kind of story are these shots telling? And when you're choosing shots to get, ask yourself like, what am I trying to convey? What am I trying to tell my audience with this shot, rather than just like conveying basic information of this is what this building looks like or these are what these people look like. Is the more you can do than that. So ironic juxtaposition, that's a little bit specific, but it's always cool when you when you can find that. And so, for example, what if you had a shot of someone trash picking from a Lexus? That would be if you had a nice shot of the car and maybe the person is well dressed but they're picking trash out of a dumpster. That would be ironic juxtaposition. That is not the person that you would expect to be picking trash out. So that tells a story. Disclosure. If, let's say, you're doing a documentary about a fire department and there's one female firefighter and a bunch of guys, you could have, for example, a picture of a bunch of coats hanging up and there's like, 9 coats in one purse or something. Filming that would be one way that you could disclose something to the audience in your shot without having to say anything about, how she's the only one or, really like hit them over the head with being specific about it. So the camera is a tool. It's kind of, it's a little bit probably cliche to say, but it's kind of like a paintbrush. And you are constantly having to choose where you're pointing it and where you're not pointing it and how you're doing that. And so you should think about that. And you should be looking around and asking yourself, how can I position this in a way that the camera is going to help me tell the story? That's a tough thing to learn, and I definitely have some tips for you. But one of the ways that you can accelerate this process is by watching a lot of documentaries. And if you want to focus on what kind of shots are they getting that you can mimic, I mean, um, first you copy. What do they say? Good artists copy, great artists steal. So, don't be afraid to just kind of straight up copy shots that you see in documentaries, especially ones if you know what kind of film you want to make. Look for documentaries like yours and see how they covered things. How did they shoot it? And it can be nice to turn off the sound to help you just focus on the pictures, and that will really draw attention to how they're using the camera as a instrument of storytelling. And it's also useful to do the other way around, which we're not really talking about right now, but turn off the video or don't pay attention to the video and just listen to the audio and see how they tell a story through the audio portion of the film as well. So it can be kind of nice to break it up a little bit. Before people, I think, get serious about filmmaking, they tend to watch movies without really even paying attention to it. And it's very interesting to know that, people have been watching movies for decades of their life before they try and make a movie, and then they're so terrible at it. And it's like, why? You've watched many, many, many films. Shouldn't you know how to make it? Well, the problem was people weren't really paying attention to the details. They were just sort of passively sitting there letting it wash over them. So if you stop doing that and you start being really attentive to shots and noting them and cool ones that you particularly appreciate, or how did they get that shot, maybe something kind of remarkable, then watching documentaries, watching movies can be a way to actually learn while you're also entertaining yourself. Okay, so one of the reasons I want to talk about getting the shots you need is because I've certainly made a fair amount of mistakes myself in this regard, and I've seen students make a lot of mistakes. And when it comes to getting the shots you need, one of the most common mistakes I see students make is they just get a whole bunch of wide shots. And it's terrible. I don't know why they do this. Maybe they're just too close to get up close to something, or they don't know what to zoom in on. But I see a lot of that in a lot of the same shot, and that's a problem. And other things that I've seen is students don't record enough what we call pre-roll and end-roll. And that's the first thing I want to talk about in terms of getting the shots you need, because it has almost nothing to do with the actual shot you're getting. This is the area that if you do this wrong, life will be hell for you if you edit, or for, if you're lucky enough to have an editor, they will want to kill you if you don't have enough pre-roll and end-roll. So what we're talking about here is video before the action that you might want to use in the film starts, and video after that. And so, if you're worst case scenario, imagine that you're just grabbing some sort of sound bites on the street, man on the street type stuff, and you hit record and the person immediately starts talking, and the second they finish you hit stop. Well, from the editor's point of view, there's no way they could fade into that particular bit of audio. There's no buffer room. It's very difficult to have just a little bit of a beat there to kind of give the audience a second to settle in on where we are, who this person is before they start talking. And then same thing at the end, if you wanted to fade the audio out a little bit, or give the audience a second to think about what they just heard before you cut away like that. That's what pre-roll and end-roll does. And some cameras will do will allow you to pre-record, basically, which means the camera is constantly running and recording and basically deleting stuff that's more than 5-10 seconds old. So when you hit record, it's actually keeping things 5 seconds before you hit record. And that stuff's kind of handy if you're in a situation where you don't know when things are going to happen and you're afraid of losing stuff, but you also don't want to record all the time, which is a mess too, and can lead to a tremendous amount of footage. So having a camera that can do that can be nice. And then just remember, after the action's done, let the camera run a little bit. Hold the shot too, if possible. So, again, with a soundbite of a man on the street, the second they end, don't pull the camera down or drop the camera or something like that. Just hold things for a second afterward, and that will make things a lot easier in editing to have pre-roll and end-roll. Okay? So that's key. Make sure to do that so you don't potentially miss some of the action or run into a situation where it just becomes hell to edit. Okay, some other kind of big picture things. One of the things we want to look for when we're setting up shots for documentary is a sense of depth. We want to feel like the shot is kind of 3D, because the TV's not, and 2D is boring. 3D is much more interesting. But we're working with generally a 2D medium. So how do we make 2D feel more 3D? Well, we line things up along this Z-axis, this line that's coming out very straight right out of the front of the lens. And we get different layers here. So you can see, like, I'm not filming this right in front of a wall or something like that. Like, there's kind of a sense of, like, well, we got a little bit of foreground here, me, and then background. That's what we're looking for. So when you're setting up your shots, how can you align some things across that Z-axis in a way that makes the shot feel like it has some depth, like the audience could kind of reach into the shot. And it's not that hard to do, but if you're not paying attention to that, you just end up with a lot of kind of boring shots. So is it the end of the world? No, it's kind of more of an aesthetic thing than it is necessarily really affecting the content. But it's not hard to do, and it makes your shots a lot more interesting. You can also help with that by having a shorter depth of field. So not only line things up along this Z-axis, but also set it up so that things in the background are out of focus and things in the foreground are out of focus, but your subject is in focus. That adds even more to the sense of 3D. And depth of field is basically the length on that Z-axis that's in focus. So if you have a deep depth of field, then everything in the shot appears in focus. If you have a shallow depth of field, then only a very short arrow. So if I had a super shallow depth of field, it could be that only my nose looks in focus, but even my eyes don't, really shallow this way versus really deep. And so one of the best ways to do that with a regular video camera is to back up and zoom in. That has the most significant effect on shallowing, shortening the depth of field in your shot. With still cameras, there's different things you can do, but for a regular video camera, when I want to get a shallower depth of field, I back up and zoom in, and that basically helps put things in the background and potentially in the foreground out of focus a little bit. That also is a cool way to allow you to do what's called selective focus, which I'm sure you've seen a billion times. And this is, you've got an object in the foreground's in focus, and then in the shot you shift the focus to something in the background or vice versa. And so the audience, as the director, you're telling the audience, look at this, now look at this. And it's kind of cool. It gets overdone sometimes. It's something that you can do, but make sure you know why you're doing it, for just because you can. It's really irritating for me when I know someone's about to do it. I see something's in focus in the bottom corner of the frame, but there's like too much room over here, and I'm like, they're gonna fade they're gonna do selective focus, rack the focus to the back, and so you just wait for it, and then zzz, the focus goes to the other thing. And a lot of times it's just an aesthetic thing, like one flower to another flower or something, and so it's just a little artsy fartsy thing you can do, and it does look nice, and it does show off a little bit of advanced camera work, but use it sparingly and make sure that it's better if it has some kind of purpose, that it's revealing something, and you're using it as a storytelling tool rather than just a little fancy way to show that you can switch focus between two things. All right, next thing I want to talk about is getting shots from unusual angles. Another problem I have with beginning videographers is they shoot everything from their perspective, and so everything is eye level, and that is really pretty boring. It's a fairly boring angle because it's the angle we see all the time. What's interesting to us is when you take the camera and put it on the ground and film up, or get up high and film down. I mean, that's why drone footage is so interesting. We can't fly like that, so it's a cool angle we don't normally get to see, and so that's more engaging to us than stuff that's just constantly filming at eye level. So get the camera up and down and look for ways to, put the camera in a position that humans normally wouldn't get in, so you end up with a shot that is more interesting than the stuff they're used to seeing. Do keep in mind that when you go above or below your subject matter, you are inherently adding some meaning to that character. So I'm sure you've seen it plenty of times in films. Someone filmed from above, it makes them look weak, and someone filmed from below is going to make them look powerful. So be aware that you're doing that. That is a tool that you can use for disclosure if you want. If you have a character that you want to try and indicate is powerful in this particular story, you can film them from below. If you have someone that you want to display as show as weak, you can film them from above. Movies do this all the time. I seem to recall American Beauty maybe had some pretty good examples of that. If you don't want to have any if you want to be neutral, then you should film them at eye level. So that's why this interview shot is pretty much right at my eye level. I don't want to look like weird and powerful, and I don't want to look weak either. So if you're doing interviews and you're trying to be kind of just unbiased about it, you're not, which is generally a good thing to do. You're not trying to show someone as particularly powerful or weak. Get the camera at their eye level. And I say that because I've had people interview me and unintentionally, just out of ignorance or laziness, I don't know, they'll set the camera up at their eye level and film down on me. And I was just like, oh, great. So making me look all weak here. And they're not meaning to, they just don't know better. So get that lens down to eye level when you're interviewing people if you want a neutral feel. Another thing that's fun to do with cameras, get impossible angles. I was doing a documentary about the Model Railroad Club here in town, and so I got a tiny little radio transmitter camera so I could put it on the front of the remote control train and drive that around and basically get what you might call an impossible angle that people don't get to experience with model trains very often. It's kind of hard to ride the train yourself. So that's a pretty fascinating, compelling shot, interesting to watch. Other things you can do, if you're filming in a school, you can put the camera on a desk to film a student, because that's also a place we don't normally stick our heads. Or you can put the camera outside of the car. In the documentary that I'm working on about driving my DeLorean from Michigan to Alaska, there's suction cupping GoPros to the side of that thing all the time because it's a cool angle, something nobody's really going to get to see in real life. And that was trouble because the back windows of the DeLorean are kind of curved. We had a camera fall off one time. So be careful about that. Other things to look for are sort of interesting alternatives for filming your subject. You can always film them straight on. That's the obvious first choice. But then start to think about other ways I can shoot them, such as, can I film them in a mirror instead? That's kind of intriguing and interesting alternative view of someone. Or other reflections in glass, or reflection in water, or some other thing like that. Shadows can be good too. It's kind of some cool B-roll of someone's shadow. And silhouettes are pretty neat as well, particularly if you're in a tough situation where they are really backlit. You could just say, forget it. I'm gonna light for the background. I'm gonna expose for the background, and they'll just be a black silhouette. It's a cool looking kind of artsy shot, and it can kind of mix things up a little bit. And sometimes you're just dying for any type of variety in your shot. I was working on a documentary. It was basically about kids in school. It was about, I think, teaching Alaska Native languages to kids in the villages, because a lot of those languages are dying out. And I just for the life of me, could not figure out any other way to film kids in a classroom. I had done every conceivable angle I could think of. So, because I wanted to have a boatload of B-roll. I wanted to have all of these just different options when it came to editing, so I could cover up people talking with shots of kids in a class, but not just the same shots over and over again. How could I get these in new and interesting ways so I'd have more choice when it came to editing of cool shots to choose from. Other things to think about, shooting through windows is a cool one. That can be kind of an interesting way to introduce someone, but certainly you can often cut to those shots even during an interview, or use them for B-roll. So go outside, film them from the outside in is a good way to go, or through other stuff, through a doorway, whatever. I remember working on a video in college, way back when, and it was a video about some organization. I believe they were like a sort of a food pantry type thing, and they were packing lunch bags for people. And so, I was there with at least one other video student, and so, we think we're hot stuff, and we're trying to come up with the coolest possible ways that we could film this to impress people. And one of the things we came up with was to cut the bottom out of the paper lunch bag, put the bag over the camera, and show food going in that way from the perspective of the bottom of the bag. It's a interesting shot. It's certainly a shot most people I hope haven't seen, and so it's a little bit, it makes for fun, engaging B-roll. You know, tiny bit corny, depends on the subject of the film, but not a bad idea. But it's that kind of thinking of where can I put the camera that's relevant to the subject I'm talking about. I'm not just doing this because I can, but I'm doing it because it somehow relates to the subject matter, which that one did. They're packing bags. That's an interesting shot. Yeah, and sort of put the audience in a place they normally couldn't be. That will make for some engaging B-roll. Moving shots are also important because they're more engaging as well. Remember, we're in the motion picture business, so the more the picture is moving, generally speaking, the more interesting. And so that's why a lot of Hollywood movies you see, the cameras are moving. They're on steady. They got steady cam operators, so it's smoothly walking along, or they've got it on rails and they're wheeling it across to keep that motion going because that keeps the shots more interesting. I've noticed a lot of, or at least to a degree, some TV news shows taking this like too far. They'll have crazy cameras come like flying around to the anchor and doing all this weird stuff, and it's like, yeah, motion is good, but you don't need to like send me hurtling through the studio or anything like that. But motion is good, and one of the cool things about motion is if you can do it well, it adds a lot to your production value. It makes your film look like it costs more to make. And that's because it is tough to move a camera perfectly, smoothly. To get the whole Steadicam vest, I mean, those are pricey, and also they require a lot of experience to really make them work well. So, if you're shooting on your iPhone with a little hand stabilizer thing, that can be cool. Drones, of course, do an amazing job of getting moving shots very smooth. And so, you can use those. It doesn't have to be up at 200 feet. You could use a drone down at eye level to get some really cool, smooth motion shots. They do a fantastic job. So, yeah. So if you're using a drone, for goodness sakes, don't get a static shot. Make it move somehow. It does such a good job of it. It's kind of a shame if it's just sitting there. I mean, that can have its purpose too, but some kind of motion is great. And if you can do something fancy with getting your camera on a cart and rolling it, that's cool. I mean, as long as the content is worth it. Production value adds a lot, and it is awesome, and it can help attract more of an audience to your story. But fundamentally, don't get caught up in making your camera wheel across the ground so that you can film something that's totally boring or vapid. So, I like to talk about how you can up production value. That's great. But remember, it comes down to what story you're telling even more. So there are some, less complicated ways you can move the camera. I don't like zooms. Zooms generally are just weird. One of the reasons that I don't like them is they draw attention to the technology because our eyes can't zoom. Whenever we see a zoom, we're reminded that there's a camera there. And so you'll notice the vast majority of the time in Hollywood, if they want to move the camera closer to something, or get a closer shot, they will physically move the camera closer to it because they're trying to convince you that they don't exist. Documentary isn't such a big deal. A lot of times we're okay with acknowledging that this is a movie being shot by people, but the zooms are just an unattractive shot. So not a big fan of zooming, but panning, tilting, you can do those well if you have a great tripod, or at least a decent one. I'm pretty happy with my Sackler tripod, which is the cheapest tripod kit. I bought the cheapest tripod kit that Sackler sells, and I think it's roughly $500-$600, and I'm very happy with it. And so that can allow you to do some pans and tilts, which is good motion and helps to make your shots more interesting. Another thing you can do that if maybe you don't have the best tripod or you're having a little trouble getting those really smooth is you can take a rubber band, and that acts as like a shock absorber, and you can put a rubber band around the tripod arm, and you can pull on that, and that will slowly start a zoom, and then you can stop, and it will slowly ease out of, or sorry, a pan or a tilt. Pans are generally easier with that method. So that's a little, basically free tip that will allow you to get some nice smooth pans without having to spend a boatload of money on some multi-$1,000 tripod or something. But again, the cheapest Sachtler tripod setup you can get has worked great for me. Another type of shot you could get that you might not have thought about are time lapses. If you've watched a lot of reality TV, you've probably noticed, especially the like home improvement ones. But it happens for a variety of them. They use time lapses all the time. Time lapse of a sunset, time lapse of a sunrise, time lapse of clouds, whatever, to convey that we're moving on to a different period. It's a sort of way of saying that time has passed. So when I was filming the DeLorean documentary, I knew I was going to need some way to kind of transition from one night to the next morning. So every night I would set up the time-lapse camera, and I had a camera that was just dedicated to doing time-lapse. That's just all this camera did. And I would set that up in the DeLorean each night and get a shot of, lights and rain or whatever else, and then sunrise. Pretty much every night. Might have been a time or two I forgot. But knowing that that was something that was going to help me with the transition from the end of that day to the next day, to show to my audience, moving on to whatever, day 4. So time lapses are a great thing to consider as well for some cool B-roll. And you don't need, of course, a fancy time-lapse camera to do it, although a lot of cameras like GoPros can have settings to allow you to do them. But you could also just record for quite a while. It depends on how much motion is happening in your shot. You could do that. Or you could also, it could be fun to mess with the shutter speed of your camera. So if there's any light in the shot, like car lights, they'll blur and just become streaks. And then you could record some of that and then put that in fast forward, get some interesting shots that way. But think about time lapse as a cool option. Let's see. When you get more comfortable and fancy with documentary filmmaking, you can, at least I've found, you can start to plan shots for things that are not scripted, which is pretty awesome. And I would say one of the higher level stages of documentary filmmaking where you can do that. Basically, you're anticipating a shot and getting it before it happens. And so it looks like something that was staged, but it's documentary, so it's not. So, for example, someone's going to come through a door, so you could have a shot of the door, and where they're going to go. So, well, of course, this is not planned. I mean, again, we get into how much you want to interact with your characters and say, I need you to open this door and sit down. I'm talking about situations where you aren't scripting the scene at all. You aren't directing it. You're just capturing things that are happening. Someone's going to come through a door and sit down. So you get yourself positioned so that when the door opens, you're right in the right spot and you can follow them to where they sit down. Or, maybe you see someone, your character walking toward their car. And so you can start with a shot of the sky and time it so that just as you tilt down to their car, they're walking up and getting it. That kind of stuff. I had some luck with that in my documentary, Finding Their Own Dance, where I was interviewing at the time, the curator of the Alutiiq Museum in Kodiak. He's now moved on to another job. But anyway, and I'm filming him talking about these artifacts, and I can tell that, and he's holding one of them, I can tell he's wrapping up his thought. Like, when you do enough interviews and stuff, you start to recognize the tone and cadence of someone who's about to finish speaking. And so I could tell he was doing that. So as I hear him like wrapping up his thought, I start tilting down so that when he finishes talking, I'm pointed at the object, and that creates a nice transition to the next thing we want to talk about. So that's a little bit more fancy, being quick to recognize the situation that's happening and make it work. But if if you got that kind of in the back of your mind, like, oh, okay, if this works out well, I'm gonna tilt down here or pan over here when I get the sense that they're done talking, or vice versa. Maybe somebody else is asking, or you are asking a question. You start on something else, and then you pan to them as they start talking. That kind of planned stuff is pretty cool, pretty fancy. Doesn't work for everybody, and but it adds a kind of nice slick element to documentary filmmaking. Let's see. Another thing that you want to do with the camera is, as much as possible, put your audience in the heart of the action. If they feel safe, that's pretty boring. And so what I mean by that is, if my favorite example is if you're filming a football game, you if it's a fiction movie, they get right on the field, right? They are right there with the quarterback, making the calls and hiking the ball. You know what I mean? And when they can't do that, and it's just NFL coverage, I mean, you see how they have the cameras flying over the field on the wires and stuff, and they're using mics in the helmets and stuff, trying to get the audience as close into the action as possible. And so that's one of the things that will make your documentary more interesting. If you're making a documentary that involves, filming a play or something like that, you should, as much as possible, be on stage with them if you can, or be, right off stage, backstage or something. But if you're just filming from a distant, safe location, it's much less engaging than if you're down there in it. Does that make sense? So I had a student working on a documentary about mixed martial arts, and depending on the scenario, it's a lot more interesting if you can be in the cage with the two people fighting it out than if you're filming from the outside, for example. Some situations don't allow you to get that close, but what you should be thinking about as a documentary filmmaker is, how close can I possibly get to this action so my audience feels like they're right in the middle of it. That means you're going to have to get used to being in people's way if this is a public event, and that kind of stinks. Shyness in documentary filmmaking isn't great. Not wanting to inconvenience people is particularly not great in documentary filmmaking. You're going to have to get in people's way, block their view from time to time, ask people for things, ask people to move. So, yeah, the more kind of in command you can be with documentary filmmaking, the better you'll be. And I say that from personal experience. So I started off like very, passive, and I want to be in anyone's way and don't mind me. And that can that creates some problems for documentary filmmaking. Sometimes you just have to be assertive about what you need and what you want and where you need to be. But if you are doing something on stage, obviously that better have the permission of the people participating. And there are things you can do, like dress all in black to help blend in, so you're not drawing attention to yourself for the audience who might be there. One of the things I recommend is, if you are doing sort of traditional documentary format where you shoot interviews and then you also have B-rolls, do it in that order. Shoot the interview and then afterward get some B-roll of them, or because what you could do then is, what they talked about, what sort of images you're going to need to help cover that talking head, because talking heads are boring. So you're going to want some B-roll that relates to that. So record the interview and then go, oh, well, you talked about, mowing the lawn. Can we get some footage of you mowing the lawn or doing the dishes or playing with your kids or whatever? Because that footage is going to be relevant to what they talked about. So doing it the other way, just filming them doing whatever activities and then doing the interview, and then realizing like, oh, I don't really have the things I shot don't pertain perfectly to what they're talking about. So get that content first, so you have a better sense of what kind of B-roll you're going to need. That said, you can when possible, you can go back and shoot some more B-roll to get exactly what you want. In my Dutch Resistance documentary, Making Choices, I was quite far through the editing process and realized I just had a couple of spots in this interview where I had nothing to show. I had archival pictures from World War II in Holland and film and all sorts of stuff, but I had just gone through everything good, and I didn't have anything relevant to what she was talking about in particular. So I went back to this to talk, the woman I had interviewed, and just got some shots of her, walking through a field or sitting at home. And the nice thing was I knew exactly what holes I needed to fill. And so that's always nice. Most of the time you're filming not knowing exactly how and if this stuff will work in your film. So when you come back, it's like, missing a jigsaw puzzle piece and you know exactly what shape and color it has to be. That's kind of nice. Very efficient. Way to go. But still, I recommend in most situations, record an interview, shoot the B-roll, and generally that will be good enough. It saves you the trip of going back. Another thing that I would suggest is come up with a checklist. Think about the things that you really are going to need to capture to tell the story well when you're going somewhere on location. You're going to go do an interview of somebody about something. Okay. Well, do you need an external shot of their house? Do you need film of them doing something in particular? Or you're filming a particular event. Like, I don't know what, I'm back to mixed martial arts, even though I've never gone to a mixed martial arts event. But let's say you're filming that for part of your documentary, so you get like external shots, parking lot with cars, people walking in. Here's the location, wide shot, audience, a shot of one fighter getting ready, a shot of the other getting ready, taping up their hands, all that sort of stuff, so that in the heat of the moment you don't forget a key shot, and then that stinks, because there are some just gotta have it shots, like the very beginning of the fight, or I always forget external shots, which is kind of a bummer. I always forget to go outside and film the building that I'm in. And so having a checklist can really be helpful to remember to get the absolute must-have shots. Some of the stuff you don't need to write down if it's not specific, but these things that if you don't get them, it's going to make for a really awkward edit. Those are the things you should write down. Or things that you just think would be really cool. You can kind of brainstorm before you even get to the location what kind of shots you think could be great, so you're not just trying to shoot from the hip when you're there. Let's see. Other things to think about when you're recording an event is getting people talking about that event. That's cool too. So what kind of sound bites or questions would you particularly want to ask? Because that can help out, especially if you're trying to do a documentary that doesn't have narration or doesn't have a lot of narration. If you can get people on camera talking about stuff like, oh, it's Saturday night and we're here and this is a big deal because blah, blah, blah. That's helpful, so you don't have to do that with narration or a title or something. Yeah, and then just as much variety as possible. And so, yeah, one of the things that we deal with here in Fairbanks, Alaska, is that we can't make a documentary here for the rest of the world without talking about sort of explaining what Fairbanks looks like, because this place is so weird. If you're doing a documentary, in some regular place in the lower 48, you probably wouldn't have to spend a whole lot of time setting the scene. And there's a lot of topics where you never really have to set the scene because it doesn't have to do with the location. But, if we're doing a documentary about drone technology, but we're in Fairbanks, people are going to be like, why are you in Fairbanks? So you're going to have to explain that. We can't really do that here without addressing this particular location. So there, think about what sort of shots do you need for your documentary that can help establish this location. Downtown shots, maybe a major landmark in the area, grocery store, all this kind of stuff that you can use to help your audience get a sense of place. And you don't always need a boatload of that stuff, but some of it can be very helpful. I don't know. I like filming gas stations and showing how much gas is. I don't know. That's just another idea. Something to give you a little sense of like this local community and what it's like. And so that's a big part of filming here is we have to talk about where we are, what this place looks like, in kind of, as quick a fashion as possible. Like, okay, we're here in Fairbanks. No, that's weird. Here's what it looks like. Now let's get on to our subject matter. Now I want to end with getting the shots you need by kind of saying don't get more, way more than you need. And this is one of the things that will just bog down a documentary. You're so terrified of missing something or not having enough footage that you shoot way, 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 way too much. And every second you shoot is another second you have to look at later and sort through. Probably look at multiple times. You have to store it on hard drives. You have to back it up on another hard drive. You have to transfer it. So don't make the mistake of just shooting just because it's cheap and or free to film doesn't mean you should film everything all the time. If someone comes to me and says, I have 1,000 hours of footage, that does not impress me. And in fact, it unimpresses me. That shows me that this person doesn't know what story they're telling, doesn't really know how to shoot effectively, and is never going to finish that because that's this, the end of Indiana Jones' giant warehouse worth of footage that just goes off into the distance and you can never possibly get a handle on all of it. So, yeah, one of the ways I know someone is lost at sea is when they tell me they have boatloads of footage. That is not something to brag about. One of the things that had a real big effect on me with that is when I started toying with shooting Super 8, because Super 8 was incredibly expensive. $700 per hour to buy the film it, and get it developed. That's not even getting it transferred to digital. And it doesn't include the camera. And so I was not doing a lot of pre-roll, end-roll, I'll tell you that. With that. But I was shooting mainly for fun and kind of for keepsake type stuff, filming my daughter and whatnot. And so it wasn't like I was really too worried about making a film, but I was very careful about where I put the camera, when I hit record, when I hit stop. And what I ended up with was a boatload of great footage. And I didn't have to sort through a lot of it. There wasn't 1,000 hours of it. Each reel is like 18 minutes or something. Was it 8 or 18 or 8? I think it might have been 8 minutes. Never mind. Yeah. So that was a real wake-up call for me because I'd never filmed in a format that was expensive. I started with tape, which was really not that bad, and you could always re-record over it if you wanted to, and then moved into like SD cards, which are, absolutely, once you buy it, it's free. Only thing that ends up costing you money is buying more hard drives to store it. So as you're a beginning videographer, it's totally natural to film a boatload of stuff because you're scared you're going to miss stuff and you're not super confident in what you're doing. But as you get better and more confident in your abilities, start thinking about how can I really just get the good stuff and not end up with a whole bunch of other shots I don't really need. Like, you don't need half an hour of footage of the external of the building. You don't depending on the film, you don't need 10 different angles. It depends on the film. It depends on, how many people are working on it and what sort of caliber thing you're working on. But generally, if this is something that you're producing, directing, editing all on your own, get maybe 2 or 3 shots, depending on how confident you are, of 20 seconds each or something. Again, it depends on the situation. It might need to be longer, and call it good, and come home with an hour and a half of footage from an event, and not 4 hours where the camera's running the whole time. So that's one of the tips that I would give is get the shots you need, but as little more than that, so that you're not just sorting through eons of the same shot over and over again, or boring stuff trying to find that needle in a haystack. Make it a needle in a bale of hay. That's a lot better way to go. Okay? Good luck. And keep practicing, keep watching documentaries to get some inspiration, and that's a excellent way to learn.